Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a PvP crewing video. We're going to be looking at the new Isolytic damage officers from last month and now this month. Discuss crewing options, whether you have all, some, or actually none of these officers, what you can do to counter them, and how you can basically get the best out of what you do have with the officers that are available to you. We're also going to look at Isolytic damage and Isolytic defense and spell out how that actually works for people. And then lastly, go over a little bit of territory strategy. As you can see, territory here has been reset, and we're on the eve of this opening up again on Wednesday. So some basic strategy there. So the first crew that I think everyone is probably already somewhat aware of is the Freeman, Honor Guard Wharf, and Lorca crew. The intent behind this is for your Freeman to activate. So this will activate Isolytic Cascade, provided that your opponent has any of these states. And it is important to note that it is your opponent that must have those states and not just yourself. So if you yourself have morale, that doesn't count. It has to be on the enemy ship. So you can have them with morale, which they'd put on themselves. Burning, hull breach, or assimilated will all work, but it has to be on the opponent ship. And if so, it will trigger the Isolytic Cascade damage. The idea behind Honor Guard Wharf is that Honor Guard Wharf will increase the critical hit chance that you have on your ship. So it's going to take whatever the value is. I've got a tier 4 one, so it's 75%. It's going to depend on the value you have. That will be added on to whatever the innate value is for your ship, and then plus and minus some research bonuses from you and your opponent. But the idea is that a Wharf tier 4 or higher is going to pretty much make it so that you crit all the time or almost all the time. And then the Lorca here is designed to put hull breach onto your opponent. Again, the tier is going to make a difference in what the percentage of that's going to be, that like the reliability of it, I guess. So at tier 4, it's a 75% chance. When it's maxed out, it's an 80% chance, and it goes down from there. There are other options, which I'll discuss in a bit, if you don't have Lorca unlocked at all, or don't have a high enough Lorca that he's going to be your best option. But basically the way that this works, he's going to put hull breach on. He's going to cause crits all the time. Crits benefit from the hull breach in the first place. The hull breach triggers Freeman's Isolytic ability, and then her captain ability is going to be to increase the number of shots that you fire in the first place. So you're going to be doubling the number of shots you fire. Most, if not all, of those shots will be critical hits, and then those critical hits will also gain the benefit of hull breach, which multiplies them even further. And then Isolytic Cascade is going to count on that total amount of damage and then apply that to your opponent in the form of Isolytic damage. So basically just a very, very powerful way to multiply your damage, that you basically get your base times your crit damage times the hull breach times the Isolytic Cascade, and that all goes to your opponent. Below deck, you can run 7 of 9 if you have her. She is going to also increase the amount of damage based on her tier that you're going to be converting to the Isolytic damage using Isolytic Cascade. And other things that kind of synergize well with this are Odo, who's going to increase the critical hit damage that you do. So at tier 2, he's increasing it by 25%. So again, you're critting most of the time, you're hull breaching. He's going to add on that as well. Mariner is going to increase the weapon damage that you do, and Tendi may help with survivability. If you later on in the month have something like Dr. Cat Lady, whatever her name is, Dr. Tiana or whatever, she might be good down here too, as she's going to provide extra Isolytic defense. But obviously I don't have her unlocked yet, as it is the first day of the month, but she's also going to be an important role in the below decks going forward. So this is pretty much the standard crew that most people are going to have, at least these 3. Carol Freeman was somebody that was unlockable just from the premium battle pass, so no one had to spend more than like the $20 to unlock her. So a lot of people are going to have this, and a lot of people are going to have this set up. Another one, which is the Interceptor setup, which is the Andy Billups setup, is going to use Gul Dukat, Garrick, and Billups to accomplish what is a fairly similar thing to what we were doing in the previous crew. So Gul Dukat now, who synergizes with Billups, is going to trigger the hull breach in this case. Garrick, in a fairly similar way to Honor Guard Worf, is going to increase the critical hit chance you have by 50% each round. And he's going to just increase that each round, whereas Worf does it 75% up front, but it doesn't increase from that. Garrick will continue to ramp that up, although you're going to find that fights are a lot shorter now. And then what Andy Billups does is basically, upon the hull breach being on, he's going to increase the Isolytic Cascade by a similar amount as Carol does. The slight defect in this is that Gul Dukat's ability, which will increase the number of shots that you get, increases the number of shots by 35% once per weapon for 5 rounds, means that it ramps up a bit. So if you were in a long fight, then Garrick's Gul Dukat's ability is actually going to be a lot higher at the end of that. But the reality is now that fights are going to be fairly short. So Carol Freeman doing extra 100% out of the gate is probably better than Gul Dukat doing 35% per weapon for 5 rounds. His would become better the longer you are into the fight, but unfortunately, you're probably not going to get that long into it, but it's a fairly similar effect and a fairly similar overall thing. The benefit to doing this on an interceptor team is that you can have Freeman on another ship, you can have Billups on this ship, and then you can actually run Ransom below decks, who works on an interceptor and increases the isolytic defense that you have for 1 round if your opponent has hull breach, which of course is the premise that Billups is running on as well. So basically it's going to be a similar amount of firepower, maybe a little bit less, but then you have higher defense down here if you want it, and it frees up that other crew so that you can have 2 perfectly good isolytic crews running at the same time. So that is one option. Another one that is going to have a new officer added to it, or is already out, but obviously I don't have them yet, is going to be the Battleship Strike Team crew. So in this case, you're going to have Lon in the middle, which is going to cause the burning to happen here. Basically has a chance of burning it for a certain number of rounds. This one is a little bit different than Dukat or Weyoun because it's not the captain ability that triggers it. It's going to be the officer ability that triggers it. And depending on your tier is not necessarily a 100% chance. However, it is going to be each time that your ship hits with a weapon. So it's not 65% per round, but it is going to be 65% per shot. But it means that there is a reasonable likelihood that you won't hit it on your very first shot, and it may take a while for that to kick in and for them to be burning. But once it's on, they should be burning the whole time. It just may not happen on your first or second shot. Then you've got Una that obviously decreases the shield mitigation of your opponent. And you've got Ortegas that actually can potentially delay weapon shots from your opponent for 1 round. Given that the game is now going to be a lot quicker fights, it may be more beneficial to keep Ortegas as the one that actually stays in and to move out Una and put in the new lower deck Bajoran guy officer that triggers on burning. He will synergize with the Battleship Strike Team. I'm going to have to probably, once I get him, test that out to see which one in the long run is better. But it may be better off that Ortegas, who delays shots, actually becomes more effective than someone that pierces through the shield a lot quicker. So usually Una, you're relying on her ramping up until you're 100% through their shields by round 3. In these fights now, you may not be lasting to round 3. So you want to basically stop as many of their shots as you can and get as many off of your own as possible. So it may be better off that you're going with the new officer in this slot instead of Ortegas, but I still got to play with that one a little bit. But yeah, that's an option there. Another one that is more of a counter crew to the Freeman thing, the Freeman, Lorca, and Honor Guard Worf, is going with a TOS crew. So in this case, TOS Uhura as captain with synergy from Kirk can basically use this, which is when you are morale equipped, when you've got morale, then you can decrease the opponent's critical hit chance by 110%. So they're using a Worf that's going to have a 70 or 80% extra bonus to what the critical hit chance is. And then their ship is usually going to have about 22%, something in that ballpark, plus and minus research. So they've got probably over 100% chance to land a critical hit to begin with. If you use this, you're going to be reducing that chance to or near zero. So it basically takes their crits out of the equation. Then Kirk is the one providing the morale here in order to give you that bonus on the ship. The fact that he only works when the health is above 30% is probably fine. Because if you get to the point that you're below 30% anyway, you're probably already dead or you're starting a fight really, really low. And then you can end up putting on this Ransom. So Ransom is the one that then works on Explorer crew. So if the Explorer has morale, he's going to increase your Isolytic Cascade by that percentage. And this becomes basically one of the options for an Explorer that is actually not only taking advantage of his Isolytic Cascade damage, but is actually really hard and strongly countering what the Freeman crew is trying to do. So instead of putting hull breach on them, instead of getting crits for yourself, you're going to neutralize their crits and then hope that basically your stuff works a little better. And Uhura's officer ability is also to remove some of their shield mitigation. So neither of you is critting particularly high, and you're able to get through their shields a little bit faster, and you've got the same Isolytic damage to play with as they do. So that is an option there. Another option to counter the Freeman and Honor Guard Worf Lorca thing is to use this setup where we actually put Weyoun in the middle. Here, he's got actually, it will be 100% once I hit confirm and go back to him. So he has synergy with Ransom and Pawn. And this is a similar concept behind it. Here, 100% chance to apply morale, so there's no chance of failing on that. Pawn is also going to reduce the critical hit chance by 63% at the start of each round for 3 rounds. So he's going to keep pushing it. So in round 1, they'll barely get a crit or 2 off in all their shots. Round 2, they should get no crits whatsoever if you make it that far. Your Ransom should then be working to activate extra Isolytic damage and doing damage to them. You're not really critting yourself, but they're not critting either. And Carol is providing extra shots, and Weyoun is providing extra shots in a similar ballpark. So again, it depends what level your Weyoun is. Carol is going to be by default at 100%. Weyoun at 88% at tier 3 is pretty close. I forget what he's at the next tier, whether it's over 100 or not, but it's in that ballpark at least. So this is another option, particularly if you don't have some of these other officers, as a way to suppress what they are doing. And again, you can run some more things below deck. You can always move around where 7 of 9 is. You can also use officers to push it a little extra, because Pawn is reducing only by 63%, and you know that Worf is probably giving 75-80% depending on its tier. There is an option to put in officers like Kira in the below decks as well, which is going to reduce the opponent chance of a critical by another 20% at tier 3, 15% at tier 2, 10% at tier 1. So if you've got those available, loading those all up on one ship so that it basically gets rid of the crits from your opponent really just makes it so that Carol Freeman is just sitting in there in the middle, and the 2 wingmen don't actually do anything because they're suppressed by the rest of your crew. So that is an option as well. And I think that was it for now. The Explorer, as you can see, is actually fairly well equipped to try and deal counter to these crews. You can, if you don't have any of these new officers, just running the straight up strike teams is actually not that bad. You're probably going to lose. You're going to be outgunned by a fair bit on the isolytic damage, but there's nothing that makes the strike teams bad anymore or anything like that. They're still pretty good, and they're still going to do well, obviously, with other people that don't have these officers yet either. So definitely, if you've got just a stronger ship, but you don't have these, you're probably still going to win with the strike team. If you're talking, however, about a comparable opponent to yourself, they've got the new isolytic crews and you don't, you're in a tough spot, because as much as you can turn off their crits, as much as you can suppress some of what they're doing, you're not going to be able to suppress that isolytic damage yet. And that's kind of the big key to what you need to do. Now, there is a nuance to this, which is very coin flippy in a sense, and it's based on how some of the officers work. So even at a fairly high level, Lorca at tier 4 is only going to trigger 75% of the time. At tier 5, he only triggers 80% of the time. You get a similar thing with some of the other officers like Giorgio, who at max tier is only going to trigger burning 80% of the time. So one advantage that things like Weiyun and Ducat have over the Lorcas and Giorgios is that they have 100% trigger rate as long as they've got their full synergies operating with them. So basically, there's always going to be a chance that when someone running this sort of crew runs into you, that their Lorca or their Giorgio or whatever their triggering officer is completely whiffs on the situation and does not trigger at all for the first round. And if they don't trigger at all for the first round, then the isolytic damage simply does not happen, and they end up basically firing blanks that round because very little else is going to work on that thing. So if you're running the Weiyun Pawn and Ransom, or even just Weiyun Pawn, Ikata or whatever, the normal strike team, then you're going to be suppressing their crits. They just misfired on hull breach, and they're not going to have the extra isolytic damage, but your guys work. So you are going to get your morale off. You are going to get your officer abilities off, and you're probably going to end up outgunning them, at least for that one round. So that's a bit of a trade-off. There's also the fact that depending on what level you are or how long you've been in the game, there hasn't been a quick way to get Lorca or Honor Guard Worf until last month. They decided to start selling them because they realized they were worth it. But I don't think very many people probably bought that. It wasn't a particularly good deal. But there are alternatives to this as well. One of those alternatives is Gorkon, and I think a lot of lower level players are going to have probably a much quicker route to a max Gorkon as they come in kind of those faction beginner packs. The way that he works is he doesn't work at the start of a round, but he has basically when you hit another ship with a critical hit, he has a 90% chance of then causing a hull breach. So basically, if you pair him with Honor Guard Worf, your first weapon shot is probably going to crit, provided they're not suppressing you on the crits. And if it crits, then you have a 90% chance of then triggering the hull breach, and then your subsequent ones will attain that benefit. However, it means that that first shot is not going to have any of the isolytic benefits. So it's a bit of a trade-off of Gorkon is much more likely to get on in the first round. However, he has a 0% chance of getting on in the first shot. Whereas Lorca is a lot less likely to get there right away before combat even starts, but he's got, even at max tier, a 20% chance that he's going to whiff. And if you get that 20%, or for my officer, 25% chance that he's going to whiff, then it's quite possible that you've lost the entire fight before you even get a chance at that second round. So that's something to consider as well. And it's one of the things that's going to make the strike team captains a lot more reliable compared to the Freeman, because she's just not going to trigger all of the time, or at least her isolytic component will. The extra shots still will trigger. So I wanted to take a look at a combat log of me hitting a ship with a Monavine, or a base with a Monavine. but I just went around hitting things to wait to find what I want it to show. So in the first round here, we actually have a case of my Lorca whiffing. So I get Carol Freeman off, so I've got 100% extra shots. I get my crit chance from Worf, and my 7 of 9 below deck is working. She's 100%. And then he does stuff. But basically, in my first round, I'm firing 3.7 million, call it 3.8, and I'm only doing 900,000 isolytic damage. So my 7 of 9 has worked, but my Freeman has not worked. So 7 is working, and whatever I've got from, artifacts, whatever percentage from that is working. And so I've got probably close to about 25% isolytic damage here that's going against my opponent. If I go to round 2, we're going to see Lorca has worked here at a 75% chance. He's now got hull breach off. That immediately kicks in Carol to give me the extra percentage of isolytic. And now my isolytic is actually outstripping what my normal damage is. So I'm doing slightly over 100% of that damage to my opponent. And if I find something with a shield still up, you can kind of see what that really impacts them to do. So here I'm doing 4.1 million standard damage. Out of the standard damage, 2.3 million of that is being mitigated. So I'm going to flash up Mr. Calculator. And basically, if I was to say 2295479 divided by 4156403, he's mitigating, 55% of the damage that I'm doing normal. And that's about right if you're attacking a player approximately the same level as you. In this case, I'm a higher level, but I'm using a weirdly weak ship that's not really meant for PvP against it. So about 55% is what he's mitigating. On the isolytic damage, however, he's mitigating 0 of it. So while a little more than half of my normal damage is getting stripped away right off the bat, 100% of my isolytic is going through. So it really means, in terms of standard damage equivalent, the 4.3 million isolytic damage might as well be worth about twice that. So because he's mitigating, and perhaps even a little bit more, because it's 55%. So instead of, if you traded me, instead of 4.3 million, this 8.8 million or so, that would be about the same amount that gets through the mitigation and gets to the shields. The shields then treat both of this normally, and the remaining amount goes to the hull. So you can see, if I rewind to pre-isolytic, where I do a shot, out of, say, let's call this 4.6 million damage, we're getting 578 going to the hull. And later on, I'm getting 1.2 million going direct to the hull on this. So a lot more is getting through. It's more than double that it's getting through, even though we've doubled basically what my damage actually is. Now, on the isolytic defense itself, the way that it works is similar to efficiency. So you have, if I have, say, 75% well, let's say 100, because that's about what I have. So 100% isolytic damage, and then you had 40% isolytic defense, then you would think, well, 100 minus 40 is 60%. That's unfortunately not how it works. It's going to work as a divisor of what the damage is. So in this case, if I've got, I think when he hits me, some of his do have isolytic. So you can find, yeah. So here, his auger has some isolytic damage. So he's going to hit me for 12,898. Get that in view. 12,898 isolytic damage. I'm going to mitigate 4,488 of that. So basically what happens is I'm going to take the amount that he puts in, 1298. then I divide it by 1 plus whatever my isolytic defense is. And I think my isolytic defense is, I'd have to check, oops, it should be 0.42. It's something like that. And then he's going to put actually through 9,083 damage and see if I was in the ballpark. In the ballpark. So yeah, so I must have a little bit more than that, probably about 45%. But basically, whatever number they're putting in, say that they're doing 10,000, you take it and divide it by 1 plus whatever your isolytic damage or isolytic defense is. So let's say I must have like 45, 46%, and that gives you what amount is actually going to get through, and you mitigate the difference of that thing. So if they've done 10,000, you have 45%, only 6,900 is going to get through. And the way that that kind of works out mathematically is your normal mitigation maxes out at 71.2%. So the highest you can have against an opponent is to mitigate 71.2% of their damage. And the way that that plays is going to be that 1 plus, I think it's 3.35 thereabouts. If you have 335, yeah, that's about right. Yeah, if you have 335% defense, then that equals about the max mitigation that a normal damage hit is going to be, and you're going to mitigate about 71% or something of that. So yeah, that's just kind of a little bit of a tidbit. Actually, that was a little bit more, so it's a little bit less than that. But that's how it works. So basically, the more isolytic defense you have, the less marginally effective it is. The first 10% you have is stronger than the next 10%, the next 10%, and so on. But it's still pretty good up until you're over 100, and then it starts to really fall off from there. But basically, if you have 100% isolytic, you're basically dividing it by half. And if you've got 200% isolytic, you're dividing it by 3, 300% dividing by 4, that sort of thing. So that's kind of how it scales up. Anyway, on to just territory itself. I've been kind of seeing on like Discord a few people talking about how they do it. And one thing that I was seeing a lot of people mention is basically that they use a lot of small ships to swarm the big ships and actually like try and stall them or something. So if the other team has whales, they actually throw Rialtas at it or Orions at it or small ships at it in order to like slow it down. And I kind of wanted to address that as a strategy because it's a terrible strategy. What you should be trying to do, the way that territory scores, is that every minute at the turn of the minute, if you have a ship alive, then it's worth 1 point. If you have a ship alive on a node, then it's worth 3 times that amount. But you don't get any points for kills. You don't get any points for how big your ships are. A Rialta and a Enterprise D or whatever are worth the same thing. So it doesn't really matter. And the reason I kind of say that is because I've seen that actually happen, and I've seen that happen to me where I'm trying to hunt around with large ships and people are throwing smaller ships at me, kind of thinking they're like disrupting what I'm doing. But what you're essentially doing is feeding those people kills. And while the kills don't matter, your ship being alive mattered. So if you're offering free kills, then you're removing ships from the map. And you should instead be with those quicker, smaller ships, just running them around in zigzag patterns and running them away from everyone. So if you're kind of like a mid, low 30s, high 20s, like player that you know you're not going to particularly contribute in terms of killing when you're in the territory, you want to be keeping your ships alive as much as possible. You always want to prioritize repairing and getting your ship back into the fight, into that system, as fast as you possibly can. And you want to be keeping those ships alive as long as possible. You never want to take, and this goes for pretty much everyone of all levels, you never want to intentionally take a fight that you don't think you're going to win. So if I think that I'm going to lose, I'm not going to fly towards that ship. Even if I think I can do a bunch of damage to it and ultimately we can kill it, it means I have to repair mine and I have to send mine back. But that other person has just taken me off the table for however many seconds that is. So if he's taken me off the table as that minute ticks over, then we've lost a point and they haven't. So what I'd rather do, if there's somebody out there that has an unbeatable ship or unbeatable ships, they're just a whale and they're dominating everything, I want everyone to be basically running away from that player as much as possible. And if that player wants to like park on a node or something, then that's fine. We know that they're going to do an outsized amount of damage, get an outsized amount of kills. If they want to park themselves and stay somewhere where they can't be dislodged, but they're not removing ships anymore, I'm probably going to leave them there because that's totally fine. If we can't kill them anyway, I'm not going to throw 6 ships at them to get them off a node that is worth 3 points. I'm not going to trade basically 3 for 6, knowing that they can just come back to the node anyway. So basically in these territory fights, if I'm hunting around with a Sanctus, for instance, then there's a certain amount of time that I'm in impulse speed, and there's a certain amount of time that I'm in combat. If you're my enemy, you want me to spend more time in impulse speed and less time in combat. And if you just throw ships at me, then that's more kills that I'm getting. It's more ships that you need to replace, warp back, etc. If I'm, however, just trying to go from here to here, let's say I'm trying to get to this node and you think that you're doing something, accomplishing something by like interrupting me a bunch of times, you're just taking ships off. I'm still ultimately going to get there anyway, and I'm still going to knock this guy off if I was capable of doing so. But instead of making it so that that 6-minute long impulse trip I'm doing nothing, you're now giving me kills during that amount of time. So if I was to trade off at the end, what would I like my combat to impulse speed, impulse time to be? I'd like it to be as close to 100 combat time as possible. Then I know that I've done basically the most effective stuff. So that's something I've just seen a lot of players do, and I think they think that it's helping or that it's disrupting or something. And I just kind of wanted to say it's a lot more disruptive if you're just running a Rialta around over here and a Botany Bay around over here, and now I have to decide, am I going to chase this like 300 impulse ship to try and kill it? Or is somebody else going to do that? Like basically, if you're going to die, make them chase you because you're wasting my time and you're staying alive while you're doing it. Now, if you are some of the bigger players in this and you are kind of more impactful on fighting, I find one of the more effective areas to do is to sit by clusters of these nodes and basically kind of camp around them. But I find that it's not super effective for you yourself to occupy them with large fighting ships. So I may attempt to occupy these nodes with kind of my 4th, 5th, 6th best ship. But if I'm sitting and parking a Sanctus or a Corvus on the node, then I'm kind of wasting my own time. I'm better off getting in here, clearing somebody off the node, and then immediately continuing to attack. So if you're my teammate, if you're somebody that maybe, you know, again, in the 40s, you can handle it well, or even if you are one of these people just running around like a Rialta or something, if I clear something out and move it out, you want to go take that right away. You want to be sitting on it as long as possible, even if you know that you can't actually hold it. Just the fact that you're holding it for a period of time, and if they want it back, they're going to have to come take it from you, in which case I may sweep back in again and take it back. But I don't want to ever be sitting on these things, occupying a large combat ship when a much lighter ship could be holding it and again getting the same amount of points from it. Now, logistically, again, I can't control 8 ships at a time, so I'm probably going to try and park like 4 of them and then move the other 4 around. But basically, if I'm going through just killing a batch, then I want people from my own team coming and occupying those spots as soon as I leave from them, so that we're getting the points from that sort of thing. The other thing, just kind of strategically, that I've seen alliances do with a good success rate is kind of the hit, fire, and collapse method. So usually, this is especially true if you are attacking somebody that already owns the territory that you're attacking, which won't be the case in this case, but a lot of people may still be based in these territories. But one of the best methods is to go in and take over the beta area, because every kill there, they're going to have to warp back to it. There's no bases in the beta area. If you're going to be able to occupy that, then you basically occupy that, move the front line so that you're covering whatever the warp path is from the original alpha area. So in this case, most people coming from alpha are going to be coming on this right side. So we want to be occupying from the left to the right to basically take all the nodes here. And once we firmly own these kind of front nodes, then I want some of my bigger players and more of the bulk of our army to collapse to alpha. And then you would basically try and secure the nodes first, and then ultimately collapse to where the planets are, where the bases are, so that you can now be picking off ships as they come out of those bases very quickly. So the idea is kind of start at the far border, sweep in until you're controlling the capital there. Now, on a flip side of that, if you're the one either trying to defend or attack, you don't always have to go by what the obvious warp route is, particularly if you've got a higher warp speed and you can get away with doing this. If I'm based in Rue Alpha and I want to attack Rue Beta, I may actually warp past it to Avanza and then turn around and come back in. And that way I'm not coming in where there's going to be a whole bunch of traffic and a big defensive line, but I'm going to be coming in from the top where it's kind of from the backfield. Or maybe I'll go on the other side and come in from the bottom from a non-tier. It depends what the warp paths of those things are. And that's a good way to come into the system from different angles. Another thing that really helps, if you do have cloak ships available, you want to be cloaking ships, because a cloak ship, of course, cannot die. So you're going to be getting points for the entire duration of that cloak. But on top of that, it's going to allow you to pick specific warp paths. So if all of my ships die in this area, then I'm not going to have any visibility into it. But if I have a cloak ship in the middle, then it means that I can take a ship and do something like this and pick my spot. I can kind of decide what angle I want to come in, exactly where I want to be. And then basically, if I just click on the system, you're going to end up somewhere in this area. But I can basically choose a place like that that's going to allow me to come in at an angle that's way above where the defenders are waiting for me. And that can definitely be really valuable. And now I've kind of gotten in behind the front line. And if I want to come and attack ships on the back bench here, then I'm free to do so. So that's just overall everything. The other big advice is fight to the end. I've seen a lot of people kind of give up partially through something, particularly if they start to lose ground, they give up. But if you're the defender in particular, it's really hard to deal with you if you are just at your home base sending out ships as fast as humanly possible. There's not much that anyone can do to really pick them off quick enough. So sometimes the fact that you're actually collapsing back and not spending that 20 seconds to warp to the other place means that you're going to have more ships on the field more frequently. And when you do send stuff out, don't send it out like that. You want to send it out like that. Make them chase you. If they don't get you in that first couple seconds, now they're running you down. And particularly if you're sending out something like a Rialta, just kind of send it across the map, and then repair your next ship, repair your next ship. Don't even pay attention to it until it gets killed, but basically just send it out and put them to the task of killing you. So I think that's a good overall refresher. I'm sure there's going to be more innovations with the crews, especially with the new guys that have come out this month. The two of them, one is great for below deck defense. We're going to have people well over that 100% isolytic mitigation, at which point there's not going to be as much of a huge damage between standard and isolytic. And I expect that's going to continue to evolve. There's going to be more things out there in the terms of artifacts, probably forbidden tech, primes, things like that give you extra isolytic damage that end up really cutting into the effectiveness of that, and it's going to swing us back to more of the normal crews again, or the strike team crews again, as those start to lose effectiveness. So this will probably be an evolving situation, and I certainly expect, sometime in the new year, probably a conversion to things above 60, where you start to have ships that have innate isolytic damage or innate isolytic defense to them. Things like that are going to shake it up. So this is kind of, I think, the meta for like this month, but I expect it to change relatively quickly, and I definitely expect people to maybe think of some things that they wouldn't have thought of before. But that's a little refresher, and I'll probably do one after all this territory stuff gets sorted out and we can see what some of the meta that develops actually is. Thanks for watching.